it's a really great privilege to be introducing Zak Weston of the Good Food Institute to speak with Swarthmore EA. Zak is the Food Service and Supply Chain Manager at the Good Food Institute. And the Good Food Institute is an international nonprofit reimagining meat production. So their mission is to develop the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. And Zak is going to be talking about the work of the Good Food Institute, as well as some career advice for anyone interested in a career in animal advocacy. So that said, I'll turn it over to Zak for a presentation, and then after that we can move into a Q&A.
Brilliant, thank you, Avi. Let me go ahead and get the slides up. I will just say with this size group, I think it probably makes sense to just do Q&A throughout. So if you have anything you want to stop and discuss, feel free to just jump in and interject audibly, and I'll make sure to, we can just address it right there. And then I'll also have some time at the end for any questions or things that you would like to discuss. But yeah, very excited to be presenting to you today. We're just going to do a brief introduction to the work that we do at the Good Food Institute, or GFI, present some of the background on why it's important that we rethink meat, as well as egg and dairy products, do a little bit of a exploration of the alternative protein landscape, and make sure to include some information on some of the career pathways that we see in this space. As I was telling AB, I first encountered both the Good Food Institute and the alternative protein industry via Effective Altruism Global, the EA conference that happens on a yearly basis back in 2016 first. So EA has been a big part of my life for many years, and also via that introduction led me into the work that I would be doing here at GFI. So always exciting to talk with others who are interested in effective altruism, as well as potentially the alternative protein industry. At a high level, just to contextualize who we are and who I am and what I do, the Good Food Institute is an international nonprofit think tank. We are focused on promoting alternative proteins, alternatives to animal-based, particularly industrial animal agriculture, meat, egg, and dairy products. Our work is focused on science and technology, so funding research in the space, promoting the techniques and tools that are driving forward the technology behind these new products. Corporate engagement, which is the team that I'm a part of, which focuses on engaging with everyone from investors to manufacturers, contract manufacturers, restaurants, grocery stores, really everyone who's a part of the value chain or supply chain for producing these products. And then our policy team focuses on creating a level and fair regulatory playing field for these products globally, as well as advocating for governments to provide research funding to this area. And we do all of that with a team of a little over 110 people in 6 different regions globally, and I personally am part of the US team. As a think tank, our role is very much to share knowledge, so almost all of our resources are open access, freely available for anyone to use. We try to focus on white space areas where we know that there are significant gaps or challenges that, if solved, will maximally advance the interests of the alternative protein industry. And we do work with everyone. So while we don't necessarily work, I suppose, with consumers, we do market research, consumer research. We work with governments and policymakers, investors, students, researchers. So we try to take a holistic view of the entire value chain and all participants and relevant stakeholders when we do our work, both our engagement as well as the research that we conduct. At a high level, there are a few significant reasons why we want to focus on disrupting or replacing industrialized animal agriculture. It's behind a lot of the most pressing issues that we see in the world today. And that's part of what initially drew me in as well when I first encountered it at EA Global, was just the sense that it was a very tractable solution built on technology and free market interventions to some of the most high priority cause areas within effective altruism. So things like global food insecurity, finding ways to use our resources more efficiently, environmental devastation. A lot of industrialized animal agriculture is behind things like deforestation and massive loss of biodiversity and the rise of monocultures. There is a direct link as well between industrial animal agriculture and zoonotic diseases that make the jump from animals to humans, which is, of course, big part of why we're having this meeting virtually today, COVID-19 being a zoonotic disease, and industrial agriculture being a sort of a perfect breeding ground for those types of diseases. And then, of course, it involves a massive amount of animal suffering, quite a few animals involved in the system globally. And that number, unfortunately, is only set to grow from here, given rising global populations, as well as increasing per capita consumption of meat, egg, and dairy products. It's, from an environmental perspective, a really inefficient way to use our just land that we have available. If we look at the total amount of land on Earth and we narrow that down to the habitable portion, roughly 50% of all habitable land is used for agriculture today. And of that land, about 77% is used to grow feed crops or is pasture land for animals, for animal agriculture, and then 23% is used for crops. But the most striking thing is that the animal protein is only 1/3 of our protein supply, whereas plant-based food is 2/3. So another way of looking at this, of course, is that it takes less than 1/4 of our agricultural land to produce over 2/3 of our protein, thanks to the inherent inefficiencies of industrialized animal agriculture, as well as the inherent efficiencies of just using plants for protein. A lot of this just boils down to the fundamental technologies that are being used. If you will pardon me, referring to animals as technologies, it takes 9 calories into a chicken in the form of feed crops like corn or soy to get 1 calorie out in the form of meat. Chicken's relatively efficient compared to a lot of other meats. It's just based on the fact that animals are, not meant to be machines. They're meant to be animals. They live their lives. They move around. They keep themselves warm. They respirate. They create manure. They are, they're sentient beings, and there's cognitive expense, thermodynamic expense associated with that. And so, as such, there's just always this inherent inefficiency involved in growing crops, transporting them to animals, feeding them to animals, and then eating the resulting meat, or in other cases, dairy and egg products, creating a lot of embedded resource usage. And as I alluded to, this is all of this inherent inefficiency, which has been made more efficient over the years with very sad, unfortunate results for animal welfare, but it has reduced the resource input usage. We're stuck with sort of this system that's already has some pretty big inefficiencies built in relative to eating plant-based foods. But we're also up against a really strong increase in demand on the demand side. So more consumers who are demanding more and more meat, egg, and dairy products. And so the central question of what we do at the Good Food Institute, as well as what a lot of different nonprofits and other organizations within the food industry are trying to answer, is how do we feed this many people sustainably, efficiently, and safely as we hit a global population that's estimated to be about 10 billion people by the year 2050. And the answer, at least for GFI's purpose, our part of that answer is to make meat and also egg and dairy products, but in a better way. So focusing on creating products that taste the same or better, are just as convenient, are just as accessible, and are able to cost the same or less to the consumer. The technologies that we focus on, what we call alternative proteins, although we, of course, are working towards a world where alternative proteins are really no longer alternative, but the technologies we focus on at the moment to create these analog products, or products that can directly replace animal-based meat, egg, or dairy products, are plant-based protein technology, fermentation, and cultivated. And I'll do a little bit of a deep dive into each of those now, just to give you a background on some of those technologies and the landscape for each. Plant-based is likely the most familiar to most of you. There's a lot of these products available on the market. We're just taking, essentially refactoring meat or egg or dairy products, taking our proteins and fats and vitamins, minerals, and everything from plants, and then combining that with water to produce something that is resembling, or at the very least displacing, animal-based meat, egg, or dairy products. A lot of the work involved here is taking harvested plant proteins, whether that's soy, or wheat, or pea protein, or even other forms, more exotic forms of protein, and persuading them to behave like animal proteins. So plant proteins are mostly used for storage, and so they tend to be globular, and we're sort of persuading them to unfold and cross-link in ways that resemble the fibrous muscle tissue of animal-based proteins, which are, of course, for the most part, being used for transportation in addition to storage. So far, the results have been fairly good, at least in a variety of a lot of the markets we're able to track. So plant-based meat sales, for example, here shown in the US, looking at just grocery stores, the retail channel, have been growing at a pretty steady clip year over year. Last year was a bit of an anomaly, 45% growth, most of that being due to the pandemic and just consumers switching a lot of their consumption into the retail channels away from food service and restaurants, but still a very healthy growth rate and much, much higher than almost any other growth rates that we're seeing throughout other parts of the food system. And there are other global numbers that I didn't include, but we've seen very strong rates of growth globally. A lot of this is being driven by the fact that the new generation of plant-based meat, egg, and dairy products is no longer targeted just at vegans and vegetarians, which remain, at least in most countries, fairly niche audiences, less than 5 to 3%. But the products that we're seeing on the market today taste better, they cost less, and are really designed and formulated and marketed towards everyone. They're marketed towards omnivores, they're marketed towards flexitarians. And again, these numbers will vary depending on which country you're looking at, but it just represents a much, much larger total addressable market. And that corresponds to much more sales potential, which enables us to create a virtuous sales cycle. About 98%, at least in one particular study found in the United States, 98% of folks who are purchasing plant-based meat are also purchasing animal-based meat. So that's a really strong signal that there's counterfactual displacement happening. And this is something that people are integrating in their diets, and it's not.
I think your voice just sort of went out a bit.
All right, how about now? Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, sorry, I don't know why some reason just decided that my AirPods would be better. So we'll keep going with these and just let me know if you run into anything else. But yeah, so this is just this kind of growth is being driven not by vegans or vegetarians, but by omnivores who are also purchasing animal-based meat. We've seen a massive expansion of the competitive landscape for these products and foods. In particular, a lot of the large existing CPG companies, a lot of the existing animal-based meat companies are not only launching products in this category, but also investing in the startups, alternative protein startups. That's something that's happening globally. And again, something we weren't sure that would happen, but seems to be happening at a pretty rapid rate. A lot of the animal protein companies certainly are not excited about the rise of this, but they don't want to be disrupted, and they're trying to take steps to make sure that they're also participating in the alternative protein ecosystem. And then there's also been a corresponding massive explosion in the number of companies or startups who have been formed within the past 10 years who are focused on creating new products and bringing different types of alternative proteins to market. We draw a lot of inspiration for the thinking about plant-based meat and plant-based eggs, as well as some of the other technologies I'll talk about in a moment, from the existing success we've seen in the plant-based milk space. So plant-based milk has about 15% share of the total fluid milk market in the United States in retail, which is a much smaller market than meat, but still obviously quite large and significant. Whereas plant-based meat has about a 3% market share of retail packaged meat sales in the United States. But if you were to just close that opportunity, total share of all retail meat sold, if plant-based meat would hit that 15% market share that plant-based dairy currently enjoys, that would be a $14 billion opportunity just in the US alone. So it's, right now $1 billion category is fairly small in the United States, but there's a lot of potential, and we've already seen some precedent for that in the success of plant-based dairy, which went from being a very niche product that was really only found in like health food and specialty stores to now something that you see available throughout almost all mainstream grocery stores and very easily accessible in the same dairy case next to animal-based milk. Some of the key technologies and research opportunities that we see when we look at the plant-based industry and the production side of things, we're really interested in diversifying the raw materials that are used. Soy and pea are certainly the predominant protein sources at the moment, along with wheat. But there's obviously like a whole host of different types of plants that we should be and could be exploring for their use as a protein source for these products. And it's highly likely that there are plant proteins out there that are going to allow for cheaper products, better tasting products, et cetera. There's also really need for research into better ways to fractionate or sort of isolate and purify the proteins from these harvested raw materials. So that's work that is incredibly high value at the moment, figuring out ways. A lot of these products rely, particularly the meat products, rely on isolates or concentrates in order to be formulated. And so taking highly purified amounts of protein, and so getting to that highly purified stage is a key step that right now is often energy intensive and adds a lot of cost to the final product. We're really interested in also diversifying the plant fat sources that are being used, both so we can find better ways of better sources, maybe away from things like palm oil or coconut oil, and also finding ways to do better things like technologies like fat encapsulation. So we're able to use whatever fat we want and maybe use better, more healthy forms of fat instead of things like saturated fat. There's no way around the fact that animal proteins taste good because they have a lot of fat, but because we are sort of assembling these products from the ground up, we have a lot more control over what we put in them. It's additive assembly versus disassembly. And so there's a lot of potential there to improve the sort of like health and nutritional outcomes of the products we're making. And the final area that's a very large priority is texturization methods. Right now, a lot of the methods that are used to take proteins and add texture and structure to them to make them resemble meat are expensive or difficult to scale or require a lot of specialized expertise. And so we're really interested in finding alternatives and improvements to this current state-of-the-art protein texturization technology. Some of the technologies we're really interested in seeing explored for that texturization component are things like 3D printing, which is being used by a few different startups to in the meat space to try to create plant-based or other forms of alternative protein meat. Shear cell, which is a technology that was actually commercialized or invented at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. We're interested in improvements to extrusion, which is currently the dominant high volume method that's used to produce texturized proteins. And then biofabrication, or essentially using things like fungal mycelium or other microorganism platforms as a way to create that fibrous muscle structure instead of deriving all of that structure from plant proteins. And there's a lot of really important sort of areas for all of this effort, all of this research, all the work that a lot of companies are doing in this space. There's a need for a lot of data work, including the crops that we're optimizing and breeding for ideal use and ideal genetics for alternative protein applications, ways to optimize that raw protein, including processing it into isolates and concentrates, and then optimizing the manufacturing process to create that texture and structure that we're looking for. So that's plant-based production. So currently on the market today, a reasonably large industry. This next section, or this next sort of technology that we're really excited about, but isn't currently available on the market hardly at all, is called cultivated meat. So we're producing using animal tissue or cell culture to create meat directly from animal cells. It's happening inside of a bioreactor. We're basically just taking a small sample or biopsy from an animal, allowing those cells to proliferate, and providing them the nutrients they need to develop into the different types of meat that we want them to. This is relatively new technology. We're borrowing a lot of the technology, and a lot of the people who are working on it come from the sort of human tissue engineering space. But what we've really seen is a pretty rapid acceleration. The world's first cultivated burger happened in 2013, a demonstration from Dr. Mark Post. And since then, we've seen a lot of different startups launch until we reached earlier, or I should say a couple months ago, the very tail end of 2020, Singapore became the first country in the world to issue regulatory approval for cultivated meat. And the company Eat Just launched their cultivated chicken product there. So there's one restaurant currently in the world where you can eat cultivated meat, since production has scaled significantly and or has scaled to a point where we can start selling it commercially, but there needs to be regulatory approval, and it's still at a fairly high price point. And so far, Singapore is the only place in the world that has a regulatory framework currently established, even though there are other places around the world that are working on it. This is a chart just showing the growth in the startups, the commercial landscape of companies who are working to create cultivated meat. So there's a number of different startups working on it, and that number has grown. These are all the ones we're aware of, or the ones that aren't in stealth mode currently. And we're also seeing a really large proliferation of startups who are focused on the supply chain, producing the inputs, the cell lines, the cell culture media, the scaffolding, and then the bioprocess design, including things like bioreactors that are required to create cultivated meat, in addition to a large number of existing large biopharma suppliers, for example, who are, already have relevant experience from other industries and are looking to expand into alternative protein production. We're still very much early days, and there's a lot to do, particularly scaling the industry to ensure that we can be economically competitive. But the early results are very promising, and it seems very plausible that this will be a massive sustainability advantage, as well as a really large, of course, animal welfare component, and that there's the potential of really significantly reducing the cost and eventual end price of products for consumers over the next few decades. One key to this, and just sort of emphasizes the interconnected nature of our economy, and particularly the bioeconomy. So far, what we've seen from our we recently published a life cycle assessment and techno-economic analysis on cultivated meat, and it's a really large, significant savings when it comes to things like global warming, greenhouse gas emissions, and land usage. But one area that it is really greedy in, not as greedy as existing animal agriculture, but still significantly requires a lot of is energy inputs, just to do all that processing and to run all those bioreactors. And so I think the real key for cultivated meat to attain its full potential is going to be using renewable energy as the source of power for the factories or meat breweries that'll be used to produce meat and run the full bioprocess. As I alluded to, Singapore has been the first country in the world to approve that, but there are task forces and projects that we're aware of in a lot of different jurisdictions to evaluate and create a pathway to market, a regulatory framework for cultivated meat, including some efforts underway here in the United States that's going to be at least as far as we know at the moment, a joint framework between the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration. And they're moving ahead on it slowly, and there's no real way to say when it's going to happen because regulatory processes sort of proceed at their own pace and are really difficult to accelerate. Some of the important R&D needs in cultivated include finding ways to improve and diversify the cells we're able to do and do better, easier cell line development. The cell culture media is probably the most critical component right now in terms of reducing cost and improving the quality of the end product. Scaffolding is the structure, edible or permeable structure that the cells adhere onto and provides the support for them to grow. And so finding ways to do that, whether we're using plant tissue or something else, even things like fungal mycelium have been evaluated for that, or gels. But that's a critical component, particularly if we want to create more structurally complex cuts and forms of meat. And then overall bioprocess design, again, different types of bioreactor tanks and different things, whether that's looking at safety testing and food quality assurance. Really every step of that value chain needs to be optimized for use in cultivated meat production, as we're currently just using stuff off the shelf that was designed for other industries. The last area that we focus on, so plant-based was the first one, cultivated technology, animal cell culture. It's the second one, and then the third alternative protein technology category or platform that we focus on is fermentation, which is really emerging as a very powerful enabling technology. So that's using microorganisms such as filamentous fungi or bacteria or algae, and programming them to express or synthesize particular proteins, or just harvesting them whole and using their entire biomass as an input for products. This is a process that's been done for a long time, and we're very familiar with a lot of the products of fermentation, including things like cheese, a lot of different types of alcohol, bread and baking, kimchi, tempeh, were also used to produce a lot of different enzymes and food processing aids or additives that are used very widely in a lot of different products. So this is something that's already sort of on the market in a lot of ways, but it's often done as sort of an industrial ingredient, so not always as visible to the end consumer. We segment the fermentation space into 3 different categories. So traditional fermentations, things like cheese, or it's using just biological processing using microorganisms to improve the functionality of a product. So a good example would be, in addition to cheese production, something like tempeh, which is using microorganisms to create a different texture and structure to the end product. Biomass fermentation is available on the market today. This is essentially just sort of like growing a whole mushroom or the whole fruiting body of a mushroom. We're using all of the entire microorganism and then further processing that and using it as a source of protein and other value-added additives. And so there are products like corn that are currently on the market that you can purchase, and a lot of companies that are very close to commercialization. And that's something I think that'll, for a lot of consumers, will be familiar in that we're familiar with mushrooms, we're familiar with fungi, we're even familiar with certain types of algae, seaweed, kelp, that sort of thing. So there's a little bit lower potentially of a consumer barrier there for these types of products. And then the third area of fermentation that's really exciting is what we call precision fermentation, or what's often called recombinant protein production, where we're essentially programming different either plants or microorganisms to synthesize high value molecules that we can use, or high value additives that we can use in different products. So there are companies like Clara that are doing this with egg whites. There are companies doing it with milk proteins. We've seen it with collagen proteins. Probably the most noteworthy example, if any of you have had the Impossible Burger, would be their heme, which is that sort of irony, bloody flavor that they add to that, is actually a product of precision fermentation using yeast to produce their the heme molecule, which is included at a very low level, but adds a lot of value in terms of the flavor, as well as growth factors, which are really important for cultivated meat media formulation. So what we're seeing is that fermentation is kind of emerging as this really important source of ingredients and inputs for the alternative protein space, and also has a lot of applicability, we think, to a number of other areas across the food industry, but we're mostly focused on the alternative protein applications. It's definitely something that's could be highly impactful. There's certainly a lack of scale at the moment, and so a lot of these companies are working to scale up. Most of the benefits in terms of resource efficiency and cost savings can only really be realized at very large scales. So it's something that it really accelerates quite significantly over time, but requires investment and working through the underlying engineering and science to make sure that it's ready for scale. So there's a lot of sort of opportunities there throughout that entire bioprocess. And there's similar optimization needs there too, for finding the best feedstocks and finding ways to optimize the microorganisms we're using, as well as the post bioreactor processes, where we're harvesting that material, we're purifying it, we're drying it out, we're then making it into, whether it's going to be a final product or an intermediate ingredient, making sure that process is low energy usage and doesn't add significantly to the cost of the end product. One of the things we anticipate to really continue is sort of a hybridization, where a lot of products will start using a variety of these approaches. So already we've seen the Impossible Burger, which derives its proteins from plants, but then is using this heme molecule, or these heme proteins from a fermentation process, in order to add an additional flavor benefit. So we fully expect that there will be products someday on the market that are using plant-based proteins, but maybe are sourcing their fat from a cell culture, a cultivated fat source, or using fat potentially that is derived from fermentation sources, just again, in order to get the optimal blend of creating an end product that has an ideal price profile, an ideal taste profile, nutrition profile, and one that can utilize all the different side streams and co-products that we have from various production technologies. Zooming out and just looking at the industry as a whole, we've seen a really strong amount of investment growth over the past couple of years, which is really exciting. There's still tremendous room for funding and need for more work, because scaling is very resource intensive, but so far we've seen strong growth, and hopefully that will continue going forward. It's also noteworthy, of course, because it was during the pandemic year, and that was certainly a challenging time for investment fundraising for a lot of other sectors. There's a lot of other groups that are very optimistic. It's not just the Good Food Institute about the future of this category. So here we've just aggregated some of the projections for where different market research firms anticipate the plant-based meat market will end up over the next few decades. So you can see a pretty wide variance, but overall very optimistic about the market growth. There's a lot of, and there's a variety of ways to sort of demonstrate this, but it really does feel to us like this is a very tractable area and that it's been relatively neglected. There's quite a few other areas that have gotten massively more amounts of R&D investment. This slide is showing an example from renewable energy, just from a single year, about $250 billion of R&D investment in 2011. And by comparison, we're aware of maybe $1 to $2 billion worth of R&D that's gone into alternative proteins R&D over the past couple of years. So it's definitely something that would benefit from more people and more research dollars. We think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there for folks who are able to invest in research. Everything feels like it's sort of just getting started. So early days, product quality and products that are really priced at a premium certainly have been things that we would love to change. But as we're able to use the kind of encouraging early days sales to justify additional investment, we think that'll lead to increased R&D investments and a more scaled supply chain that enables us to make those the same products and more products cheaper, tastier, better nutritional outcomes. And hopefully that sort of completes a virtuous cycle that'll lead to eventually a really large scale growth of the industry. For the sake of time, I'm going to jump ahead to just a couple more slides in that section, but I did share the slide deck with AB in case you all would like to review it later. I just wanted to highlight a few of the career pathways that are relevant, and then we can jump into the Q&A part if there's any questions that anyone has. I think at a high level, and I am of course biased because I do already work in this industry, but this is a single field or area that can change so many different things. It touches a lot of different areas, economically, anthropologically. It affects a lot of different cause areas, I think, that are very important to EA audiences, including things like animal welfare, environmental sustainability, human health, and poverty. So there's I think, a really massive opportunity here, and there are leveraged opportunities within the food system to change all of those things. There's certainly a massive need for different types of skills, in particular, some of the skills listed here. A lot of the need right now is for technical talent. It's an interesting competition here, or an interesting workforce need, because it's a new industry. It's not necessarily the case that you can just go out and get a career or work in a program that's devoted to alternative protein science, but there are a lot of opportunities for existing science and engineering disciplines to have that expertise and skill translate over into this area or this industry. So these are the areas that are most commonly recruited out of for technical talent, and certainly would be an emphasis for folks who are interested in sort of the scientific or technical side of the industry. But that's also balanced too by a really big need for people who are willing to market and sell and develop and build the companies and startups that are constructing these products. So there's certainly a need for scientific expertise, no question, but this is also a category that's right for entrepreneurial folks who want to start companies, or folks who are interested in joining early stage startups to help them build their go-to-market strategy and help them grow in the early days. And scaling a food business is certainly difficult from a business standpoint, but there's a lot of sort of tailwinds behind this category. We have a number of different resources on our website, which is gfi.org, including a database showing here of different solutions. Those are like research projects, businesses that we think need to be started, or areas, ecosystem level interventions of things that will help accelerate the alternative protein industry. We also have a variety of career resources, including a student resource guide, sort of profiles of different people who've been pioneers in this space, in case that's useful to just understand the different paths that leaders within our space have taken to get where they are. You can find that out online as well. We have a research grant program if you're looking for, if you have research that you're interested in doing that would be relevant to alternative proteins. We do award grant dollars. You can find out more information there. And then an industry careers portal if you're looking for jobs or internships with different companies in this space. And then finally, we have a community of scientists and entrepreneurs with things like monthly webinars and ways to get connected with other people who are working on or interested in working in the alternative protein space. And you can join that as well if you're interested. There's a number of different ways that universities can be promoters of alternative protein innovation. So obviously things like courses and majors that can train the relevant disciplines and build the relevant expertise. There's a lot of foundational, both basic and applied research that needs to be done, for which a lot of universities are ideal hosts or places to make that happen. Hopefully there's a community that develops around a lot of different universities that can help accelerate and create interdisciplinary linkages, since we're just inherently as an industry highly interdisciplinary. And of course, there's a need for folks who are a lot of the types of people you tend to find at universities, whether that's scientific expertise or just an entrepreneurial passion to make the world better. And so this seems to represent a opportunity. And we do have some student groups already in existence at a few different global universities. And this is hopefully an area we like to see expanded over the next few years as well. So with that, I will stop and we can jump into any questions that anyone has or discussion. And if you have think of anything else later, you're more than welcome to contact myself, or I've also left this contact here. Amy Wang is our student and university coordinator. So you're also welcome to reach out to her as well for questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Zach. I think that was an amazing presentation. I'm just going to hit stop record before moving into Q&A.